I have messed with the new Titan cards, and I think I know what decks are going to break the meta on day one. We're going to go ahead and just jump right into this, because I know that you guys have been waiting to figure out what decks are going to be the best decks to possibly play on the day one of the Titans expansion. And after messing with the cards, I think I know what ideas are going to be a little bit, you know, not necessarily bait, but are going to be a little bit harder to flesh out as like full-on optimized decks, while some of these other decks are just going to hit the ground running on the first day. And I believe that Sagiris, Thaddius Warlock is actually going to be a legitimate deck to the point where people are going to hate this idea a little bit more. And whether or not this is going to be the perfect 30-card version is not really what I want to be focusing on. I want to focus on archetypes and on the ideas of decks in order to give people the thought process of what is going to be a safe craft on day one and what is really going to be working on day one, because there are a lot of things from the Titans expansion that are really going to shake up the meta, and I absolutely think that is a fact. Festival of Legends sort of had this issue where like the new cards, new legendaries, were not impactful enough in order to really make that big of an impact, I guess. I hate to use the same word twice, but some people were really worried about Festival of Legends cards not doing enough, but Titans cards are not the same. These Titans cards are massively powerful, to the point where the reason why we're running Sagiris and Thaddius Druid, and Thaddius Warlock, is because you can cheat out Sagiris as quickly as possible, so you can get that never-ending value of the imps. But all in all, this is still just Thaddius Warlock doing what this deck does by cheating out a whole bunch of stats all at once. And the reason why this can work really well is because you have cards like Forge of Wills in order to set up, you know, a big turn. And honestly, Loken, Jailer of Yogg with Forge of Wills is an insanely consistent combo, considering that you have so many minions that are like, you know, a 10-10, an 11-11. You have a 6-6 that sometimes you don't mind getting in your hand, especially when you have the Amorphous Slime ready to go to get this card out. So it's kind of interesting how Loken was a card that I thought would be a pretty big meme, because we're all thinking about the 15-15 that it can summon, but this deck is actually a lot more consistent than I gave it credit for, and I have another version of this deck that actually might be the perfect 30, because I'll tell you right now, I'm not too sure about Habeas Corpse, and I think there should be a second Infiltree Reanimator in this deck, but I have really wanted to focus on the fun cards and on the new cards, such as Chaotic Consumption. Chaotic Consumption could be a great way of getting your Amorphous Slime value if you don't already have Shallow Grave, or it could just be a really useful removal option if you just want to kill off your tour guide and, you know, get a fairly even trade. As well, I think I talked about this card already a little bit, but Thornveil Tentacle is like a perfect card for any control warlock. You know, you need ways of being able to remove the board, and it sticking and having lifesteal can do a lot for you. But case in point, Thaddius Warlock is going to be insanely consistent now that we have Sagiris and Loken, Jailer of Yogg, as well as the Forge of Wills to go into this deck, which is going to give it unbelievable consistency and not only summoning big minions, but pressuring your opponent. Next up is going to be the deck that I think is actually going to be the most powerful deck from this new expansion, Titans, and it's mostly due to the fact that Sif is literally just Malygos, but better. And what do I mean by that? Obviously, Malygos has +5 spell damage that is, you know, really consistent, because you don't have to invest anything into it. You just have to invest around the combo and maybe a few mana cheat cards in order to get it out sooner. But Sif is literally a card that rewards you for doing what you already want to be doing in Mage. Discovering spells, keeping your opponent at bay, and building up for some kind of gigantic OTK. And the OTK cards in this deck are absolutely insane. So let's say that you play all of the spell schools, which I believe is 7 different cards, which is possible in this deck, by the way. Molten Rune literally becomes a Pyroblast that deals itself twice. It is insane the capabilities that Molten Rune has when you get to forge it and you get to cast it for 3 mana. And that's not even going into the fact that this deck also has Arcane Worms to give you Arcane Bolts. And some versions of this list have been running the Flame Geyser just as another way of getting cheap damage, but you also have Frozen Touch. You have plenty of ways of finding more random damage through Infinitize the Maxitude, Prismatic Elemental. Watcher of the Sun gives you a Holy Spell. That's the only reason why this is in the deck, but it's also good healing for sustain. So I think this card is actually one of the best forge cards in my opinion, because healing is always a nice bonus, and then getting you know, a holy card out of it is just really consistent, especially for this deck where all you want to do is find a lot of different class cards. So I think that that has a lot going for it. Regardless, you have Reverberations, which is an insane shadow card, so you don't have to let Discovery of Magic always find like a shadow card. This is probably the most versatile card in this entire deck, and I'll get into my my thoughts on Reverberations here in a second when I talk about why Norgannon is in this deck. But Wisdom of Norgannon as well as Elemental Inspiration give you even more consistency and rewards through finding other cards of different spell schools, which makes cards like Discovery of Magic all the more consistent. Prismatic Elemental can give you, you know, cards that aren't in your spell school. So this deck feels like a really tight list. And honestly, I took this idea from Zacko, but I changed 2 cards. The cards that I changed were an extra copy of Reverberation as well as Lady Nazjar. And the reason why these cards are in the deck is because there is a possibility of being able to do all in one turn 20 damage combo for 10 mana if you play Nazjar as a discount and you hit both of your Reverberations. Now I know this sounds like a really complicated setup, but there's an easier way of doing this. If you play Norgannon and he survives a turn, going into the next turn, you can cast his second ability, Reverberations that card twice, and then you have 2 Norgannons that deal 20 damage ready to go by as early as turn 7 if you play him on turn 6 and he happens to survive. And another reason why Reverberations is going to be extremely good is because you can copy other Titans, get rid of them immediately, and then use the ability for yourself depending on how good the ability actually is. So trust me when I tell you that Reverberations is probably going to be the most busted mage card to take advantage of, not only because you're going to be able to use it yourself, but because you can use it against your opponents in such effective ways. But with all of these spell schools and Sif essentially having +5, +6, even +7 spell damage, that's going to be the main reason why you win. With Molten Runes, with Frozen Touches, as well as with the Arcane Worms giving you bolts to where 1 bolt can deal 10 damage. So the Norgannon combo is not what this deck is entirely about. It's still about being able to play for tempo, keeping yourself alive, and setting up for that gigantic Sif combo. And honestly, I could see this card going to 7 mana for that exact reason. Like, this card being at 6 mana opens up so much leeway for OTKs. Where if it was just 7 mana and Molten Root and that was all you really had unless you built up like the Arcane Bolts, this deck is going to be extremely good. So if you want my #1 recommendation on what to craft on day 1, I really do believe that Sif Mage is going to be the best deck that you might be able to play. There was one deck that I forgot to talk about, and it was the Mommy Druid. This is the archetype that I hyped up the most during some of my streams because the capabilities of this deck are absolutely insane, and I had one of the most hilarious games with this deck at the end of the Theorycraft stream, and it's just... I'm going to let that video speak for itself. I'm not going to let you guys know exactly what happened, but the idea of this deck was to utilize the Ignis with the Hero Power archetype that has already been established in Druid, because if you're able to get the Wind Fury weapon out of the Ignis, the Eternal Flame, then, you know, your Hero Power giving you a +5 attack is suddenly giving you an extra 10 damage, and if you have other ways of being able to increase your Hero Power turns, with like getting like another Groovy Cat or maybe putting in more all-in aggression on this deck by making it like all-in on the Hero Power, then you have a lot of capabilities of this weapon dealing ungodly amounts of damage. But I wanted to combine this idea with another idea that I think has a lot of potential. And that is what I am dubbing as the Mommy and Daddy combo. Because if you have 11 mana thanks to Audio Amplifier, if you play Thaddius on the even polarity, then you can immediately play your Aranon the Life Binder to fully restore your mana. Then you can play Freya the Keeper of Nature to double the cards that you have on the field, so you get another Thaddius, you get another Life Binder, and then you can use that second Life Binder ability to automatically heal up your hero all the way. And there might be a possibility of trying to put in like a Jailer in this deck, or one way or another, but since I had to run a lot of the newer cards, I kind of didn't find the room for that kind of combo to be a thing. But this deck was an insane amount of fun, and I can't wait to show the video of me popping off with this deck, because there's just a lot going for this deck. You have Astral for damage, you have the Hero Power package in order to, you know, supplement your early game and keep the deck cycling so you're not just having a bunch of dead turns, because that was the big issue with my first iteration of this deck, is that, unfortunately, it just kept dying. Like, I couldn't get to turn 10, and I couldn't get that big payoff turn with the Life Binder, so there was really no reason to be running this deck because everything was stomping Ramp Druid. But then I went up against Language Hacker, and I'm pretty sure this is just the exact same list. I don't think I took anything out of this deck, so this is his list. I gotta give him credit for that. But oh my god, the potential of this deck is insane. To where I'm just going to let the video speak for itself when I eventually post it, but just know that this was one of my favorite archetypes to play because I love the idea of having essentially Aviana Kun back into the meta, and with Freya, Keeper of Nature, being able to double up our hands, there's a lot of potential to do goofy things with this deck, as well as maybe doing something meta relevant to where, what if we make another Astalor? Just saying, you can make another Astalor with this deck, and there's a lot of capabilities of this deck being insanely powerful to where I feel bad that I didn't originally record this at my first recording session with this this video, because I'm editing the video right now, and I completely forgot to put this in here. But regardless, Hero Power Mommy Druid is an archetype I'm really excited for, and maybe there's a different way to build the Mommy Druid archetype, but this is going to be the archetype that I'm going to try and make into a legitimate deck that hopefully you can grind the ranks with. Another archetype that was absolutely slapping people left and right during the Theorycraft event was a version of Treant Druid, which I don't believe this deck is the most consistent version of this deck. But let me go ahead and walk you through my thought process, because this deck feels extremely good if you can pop off the combos. So the reason why we have cards like Rhythm and Roots in here is because we just really care about having a board present, so that way we can play Drum Circle. Drum Circle is extremely consistent due to cards like Disciple of Aranar, where literally you get to play both abilities at once, and Drum Circle, it used to be that you really needed to set up a board for it to be good. Now the card can just, you know, generate a board by itself, and you can also do a similar thing with Ancient of Growth. So it's just really important that you make it to like that turn 7 turn, which is why we have cards like Wild Growth in the deck, which honestly I could see this card getting cut. I was kind of like lost on the best way to do it, and I have other people's decks coming up here that kind of put this deck into perspective. But the main reason why this deck is really good is because the card Cultivation. Cultivation is so easy to get down to 0 mana, because all you have to do is summon 8 Treants, and this deck does nothing but play Treants, and you have cards like Solar Eclipse into Cultivation after you've summoned a massive board that just really make this deck sing. Like, it's insane how well this deck can just keep generating onto the board, and it reminds me of like old Token Druid, where you would clear board, and you would clear board, and there's still a Treant, and there's still something on the field to where, you know, you double Arbor up, or you double like a Savage Roar, and you still win the game because only 1 or 2 minions survive. This is going to give a lot of those similar vibes, and you have cards like Topior in order to give you a lot of consistent board generations even after you've used all of your big Treant turns, because you still have, you know, you have Ancient of Growth, Drum Circle, you have Forest Seedlings that when it takes 2 turns it gives you 2 Treants, you obviously have, you know, Witchwood Apple, Natural Causes, you have a lot of ways of generating Treants, and you even have cards like Embrace Nature in order to consistently draw out your Ancient of Growth and your Drum Circle in order to give you that insane amount of capabilities. Now, Igneous isn't really supposed to be in this deck, all honesty. This was my idea, putting it into the deck for, like, you know, a weapon that deals damage, a weapon that can maybe, you know, get rid of those really big minions that you're having an issue with, because this card is pretty flexible, but this probably is not the archetype that you really want to put this in. So this was just mainly, you know, to get the 10 card requirement for the new cards, and I also wanted to experiment with it a little bit. But yeah, I think Ignis is probably a card you can easily toss out of this deck, so don't worry too much about that. But there are other versions of this deck that I think are going to be extremely good, but I just had to put this in my video because I think that a variant of this deck is going to rule Hearthstone. And speaking of ruling Hearthstone, oh my god, Mech Paladin is an absolute monster. And we're not even using, like, the new aura that gives you a lot of attacks every single time that you have, you know, a minion cross the line, essentially. And I mean, maybe that card doesn't go in here, but I literally did not drop a game with this deck. And I think I played 3 games with it, and I realized, okay, yeah, this deck is nuts. If you don't have early game removal, or if you don't have silence, there is no way you're going to stop Mech Paladin. And Mech Paladin is just one of those decks that I really, like, I knew that it was going to be good, but I had no idea it was going to be this good. So I think that Mech Paladin has a lot of potential, and really there's not a lot to explain with, like, the new cards here. I'll just say that, like, you know, the cards, the Spark Bots that you get from Drone Deconstructor can really dictate how well this deck does. because you can get cards with Lifesteal, you can get cards with Wind Fury. Wind Fury is just by far the most busted one out of all of these, and if you're trying to like save a minion so you can like magnetize and going into the next turn, you can stealth it. These cards are really good. These cards are insanely good, and I really didn't even get to utilize the X21 Repair Bot, even though I feel like this card is really good too, because it's a value card in an aggro deck, and sometimes you need those extra bits of value in order to, you know, if your board gets wiped out in the beginning, you can then rebuild, so to speak. And it's another magnetic card that works with Inventomatic, which gives +1/+1 for every single time you magnetize a card. Noble Minibot, another really good card to just give you a lot of overall consistency with the deck. And obviously the rest of the deck kind of makes sense with, like, you know, Automaton, Mooncatcher, Bubblebot, and of course, you know, War Gear and all these other magnetic cards that give you a ton of value. It's just really insane how good this deck feels. And again, I didn't drop a single game with this deck, but there's another mech deck that you definitely need to give respect to. And this is where I'm going to start using lists from other creators, because I could not figure out the best way to build these lists, but as soon as I saw them built on Twitter, it just made a lot of sense. So Zeddy had a lot of success with his version of Mech Rogue, and I can already hear you guys, you know, clamoring in the comments below, being like, Voltron Prime is the worst, is the absolute worst Titan card out of all of them. This card can't be good. How is it that this card is good? Well, it's because this Titan doesn't play like the other Titans, where it's like all about the late game and doing like these gigantic bombastic combos. This is a good mid-range card because you can play it for cheap, where if you have prep into Bone Spike, then you can play this card out as early as turn 4, turn 3, depending on whether or not you have coin. And you also have cards like, you know, Coppertail Snoop, which gives you extra coins, so you have extra ways of being able to cheat out this card as soon as you can. And apparently Lab Constructor, I didn't really get to mess with this card, but Lab Constructor being able to summon another copy of a card is actually extremely consistent depending on how big you get your mechs. And Mimron the Mastermind, oh boy. These cards that come out of the Mimron, I'll just go ahead and put them on the screen here so you know what they do. There's a lot of really good cards, and I'm not sure if I've seen all of them, but the two that stick out the most are essentially, you know, the sap for 1 mana, which makes a lot of sense, and the swapping of stats. The swapping of stats can obviously be good to get rid of, like, a gigantic minion that your opponent has. But something else that you can do with it is, say you have a 1/1 and a 10/10 on the field, you attack with the 10/10, you swap their stats, and then you attack with the 1/1 that now has 10 attack, and that is an insane amount of damage. And I ended up missing a lethal on stream because I didn't understand that interaction as soon as it was in my hand. So I feel like everyone that's trash-talking Mech Rogue has just not messed with the deck and hasn't seen, like, the insane capabilities that can come from it. And Dane is another creator that was doing really well with Mech Rogue because Mimron the Mastermind has a lot going for it as a card, to the point where I feel like Mimron the Mastermind is a lot better than the Voltron Prime, which I guess kind of makes sense because he made Voltron, if I'm remembering this correctly. I don't know World of Warcraft logic or lore or anything like that. Feel free to, you know, correct me in the comments. But regardless, like, I still went in on a miracle version of this deck with the location and running like a bunch of like value cards and stuff like that, and I did pretty well at that deck. But if we're going all in on mechs, it doesn't really seem like it's that bad of an idea compared to other creators that have had success with this. And maybe this is just the field of decks that we were going into. Maybe this deck flops against some of the more aggressive stuff that's already available on the ladder. And plus, you know, cards like Solid Alibi are going to be probably the downfall of this kind of deck, if they're not able to get, you know, a lethal as soon as you want. But I think that Mech Rogue has a lot of potential that a lot of people are not really considering. And, yeah, this deck is going to need your respect if it's actually going to be competitive. Next up, we have Zeddy's version on Control Warlock, which looks extremely similar to mine, except he's got the Imposing Anubisath. There's another version of this deck that I'm going to show you guys, so there's 3 different versions of the Control Warlock, which, again, this was like one of the MVP decks outside of like Sif Mage, to where almost everybody was trying their version of this deck. And I'm just trying to give you guys as many different ideas as possible because I don't believe that my version is the best one. He's got the Armor Vendor in here as well as the Finley in order to shuffle back the Undeads if you need to do such. Forge of Will with Imposing Anubisath was like the combo that everyone was talking about when Forge of Wills was printed. He's even gone so far as to put in the Disposal Bot in this deck, which gives you a little bit more healing and removal, which actually makes a lot of sense. Like, I think the Disposal Bot The best way to describe this card is like Dynomatic, except you can get lifesteal with it, and even in the situations where you can't forge it, it is still, you know, just a pretty good removal card, especially when you combine it with cards like Mortal Eradication that deal damage and then heal you if they kill something. So I think that Control Warlock is actually going to be on the menu, as it's been struggling throughout this entire expansion, but Control Warlock feels like a really safe craft just due to how many different lines it has now. It's not just all in on Thaddius, and if Thaddius doesn't deliver, then suddenly you're screwed. There are other options that you have available in this deck, and I just really feel like Control Warlock is going to be extremely powerful on day one. Next up, we have Plague Death Knight, and the reason why I'm not showcasing my deck is because it didn't do too well. I'll just go ahead and put the deck list on screen. I had an idea of just going all in on Plagues and Eggs, and it was mostly just because the name was really funny, but also it was a way to utilize the Yelling Yodeler with a lot of these other curse cards that we have been, or I'm sorry, plague cards that we've been given, because Distress Cavalier with Yelling Yodeler as well as Deathbrow was an idea that I really wanted to be really good. But kind of like the issue with Bomb Warrior, if your opponent doesn't draw the plagues, then there are times that this deck just feels like a much weaker aggro deck. And Zeddy already weighed in with an idea that we could just make this into an aggro deck instead of trying to make it into some kind of like weird, you know, fringe combo mid-range deck, to where you gotta hope that your opponent is going to be able to draw into those cards. Because one thing I will note about this deck, and one card that Zeddy doesn't have in here, is actually the card that draws two cards for both players. My biggest issue when playing Plague Death Knight was against decks like Control Priest or like Control Warlock. They literally would just keep themselves at 10 cards. Can't play around that, unfortunately. Like, you can mill their cards, but then suddenly you're going to be milling the plagues. And, like, my list has the 4-drop that can take a look at the next card in your opponent's deck, and you can either put it to the top or to the bottom in a way of being able to, like, kind of, like, try to get that chain going, try to influence that a little bit, but I'll just tell you, it just really didn't perform. The best way to play this deck is probably going to be all-in aggression, but the problem with being all-in aggression with this deck is that you don't get to run cards like Marrowgar, you don't get to run cards like Grave Strength, and you can't discover them, so you have no way of really being able to utilize those cards. So maybe you put in an anti-magic shell into this deck. Seems a little slow for not enough payoff, honestly, so running cards like School Teacher, Nerubian Swarmguard, as well as the Rancher, just really solid cards in order to give this deck as much meat as possible. And then you have cards like Magatha, which really makes sense as a way of being able to give yourself a lot of, you know, a lot of value and resources when you really need it. And I think the reason why Sylvanas is in this deck is literally to steal Titans. Stealing Titans can be really, really funny, to the point where Sylvanas might be played in a lot more decks that run a lot of minions, because stealing a Titan from, like, Priest, for example, is going to be extremely important, because I'll tell you right now, Control Priest is really good. No, I do not have a deck, because I'm not going to be plaguing Hearthstone and spreading that like a virus or anything like that. But one thing I will tell you is that the Primus is an insanely good card, especially in a deck like Blood DK, to where it's going to be really difficult for the Primus to see a lot of play in these style of of Death Knight decks. But Blood Death Knight is really happy to have the Primus as like an extra way of gaining health, as well as a really valuable removal tool that can give you even more resources through discovering another rune card. So the Primus, absolute work of art. The Plague archetype, I think it's a little weak. But I'm still going to be messing with this archetype because I really want Plague Demon Hunter to be good. Mostly because I want a multi-rune Death Knight deck to actually see play. But I have to say to Blizzard, I am really sad. I am extremely sad that these just aren't available for Rainbow. Like, I think that Rainbow Plague Demon Death Knight has a lot of potential, being able to, you know, build up a really massive climactic necrotic explosion, or being able to utilize other cards, because unfortunately we can't run any blood cards. We can only run, you know, one frost card, or one rune frost cards, and just, I would really like to have a little bit more flexibility, because in my opinion, if Plague Death Knight doesn't get to see much play, the same Death Knight decks are going to be ruling, and honestly, as someone that really enjoys the Death Knight class, I am really worried that we're just going to essentially go backwards instead of messing with any of these new cards. Outside of the Primus going into a few of these decks, I really don't envision Death Knight decks changing a whole too much. Next up is an OTK Nature Shaman, and the only reason why I'm not showcasing my deck is because I have seen other people's decks, and man, did I miss the mark on Inza, and I'm gonna blame my Twitch chat, because they were like, oh, Inza's not powerful enough, you have to run the Queen. The Queen has so much more capability in this deck, when literally Inza can generate these insane OTK-like combos due to Lightning Bolts costing 0, your Lightning Storms essentially being able to cause 0, depending on how you use your Flash of Lights. Like, the big setup for this combo is trying to use either 1 or 2 Flash of Lightnings in order to discount your spells to where you are able to play a bunch of nature cards with cards like Champion of Storms. And you don't even need to forge the Champion of Storms because you still get that ability every single time you cast a nature card, but you want to fill up the board, you want to play Bioluminescence, and then you want to go all in with Crash of Thunders, with Lightning Reflexes to find extra copies of Lightning Bolts, and then of course the actual Lightning Bolts in your deck. But another way this deck can be really consistent is running Horn of the Windlord with Turn of the Tides, because you could do a similar combo to where if you find more Turn of Tides from the Lightning Reflexes, then you have an insane amount of damage coming out from Horn of the Windlord. And this is how I love to see Horn of the Windlord actually be used outside of just playing it in Unga Bunga Mech Paladin, where the setup is not even there, versus this entire deck is trying to set up a gigantic Horn or a gigantic spell damage combo. So this makes sense for Horn to feel like a balanced card, but I still think that Horn is a really powerful card in Paladin, and I'm really worried about Pure Paladin taking over the meta. But Galganeth, the Thunderer, extremely great card in order to draw out all of your overload cards to the point where Inza really does feel necessary in this deck. And maybe I was focusing too much on like the Radiance of Ashara combo and running like Prescience in order to draw these minions, because this deck just has a lot more removal with cards like Primordial Wave and I think there's something else in this. Oh yeah, and Flow Rider, because I took Flow Rider out of my deck. This just feels like the way to play this archetype. And I saw Lunaloveee. Lunaloveee ended up had an extremely consistent win rate with this deck. But she had an unbelievable win rate with 23-7 with a lot of throws. And obviously the Theorycraft meta is a bunch of silly nonsense, but Shaman really does feel like it has major potential. I recommend giving it a try. And I also saw Mick Banter running around with a deck very similar to this, and he was doing very, very well with this deck. But I feel like, you know, Shaman's been kind of lacking interesting archetypes for a while, because it's pretty much been Totem Shaman or bust. And you have, like, you know, From the Other Side Shaman, but unfortunately, that's just, like, it falls into a fringe category to where we really can't make it that useful. Trust me, I tried to make Rivendare Shaman to a legitimate deck, and it just did not work. But this deck really does feel like it has everything that you would want in a Shaman deck, to where it has, you know, an insane overload combos, you have insane consistency out of your card draw with cards like Ancestral Knowledge. I'm really concerned why there's not, a Farsight in this deck, but I'm assuming that Thunderer essentially acts as your Farsight by making your first card cost 3 less. You're not necessarily drawing from it, but you can draw 3 overload cards from it, so that's just good enough. So maybe Farsight is just me being a little bit more nearsighted instead of farsighted. I'll shut up now. But regardless, I think that Nature OTK Shaman has a lot going for it, to where this is probably going to be the deck that I play the most on day 1, because I really wanted an OTK Shaman to be good, but I could not build the deck properly because I misunderstood how Lightning Reflexes worked. I thought this card acted like Fireheart, what's her name? I forget the card, but the card where if you discover a card, then play it, you get to discover again, and then again, and then again every single time you play the card. It doesn't work that way. You get to only discover 1 extra card off of Lightning Reflexes, so don't fall for that bait like I did. Just play this deck, and I think that you will find that love for Shaman is going to be a little bit rekindled. But if you are someone that likes Totem Shaman, I've got some good news for you. We can now hero power after we have a full board of totems. It doesn't really make a difference because this isn't anything with any new decks, but I just thought this was really funny since we were talking about Shaman. And the last few decks that I will tell you guys is actually decks that were posted by NoHands Gamer, because I'll tell you right now, I definitely did not get to mess with, there's no easy way to put myself here, so I'm just gonna put all these codes down below so you guys can see them. But honestly, I don't know about Armor Warrior. Armor Warrior feels like it's a deck that's gonna have a lot of trial and error to find the good cards, and I actually did have an Armor Warrior that did pretty well, but the combo is definitely way more gimmick than it is meta relevant, but a video on that will be coming up in the future. future. But here are the decks from No Hands Gamer that he recommended. The decks on the left are the best, to the decks on the right are the worst. So Armor Warrior, not that good of a deck. He tried to do something similar with the Plague Death Knight, to where we're running Death Growl, we're running Yodeler in order to shuffle as many of the plagues as possible into the deck. He's also running Eggs and more of an aggressive package with like Sidekick and the Necromancer to try and give this deck as much potential as possible, even running cards like Acolyte of Death, which I understand the thought process, but I think this card is unfortunately just not what the archetype needs. It needs more tempo. But I love the look of this deck, so I wanted to share it with you guys. But Plague Death Knight just really feels like it's lacking something, and unfortunately, I don't really know what to suggest. So there are the ideas for Plague Death Knight if you've really been looking forward to that archetype. There is also Secret Hunter, which I didn't want to bring this deck to light because I think this deck might actually become very problematic as the meta progresses. But this isn't even like the version of the deck that I was thinking about, because this isn't even all in on the secret package. Like, we don't even have the 2-drop that summons a secret for free, for example. And honestly, that may not be, you know, that insane of a mana cheat system, because obviously, oh, you're only spending 2 mana to cheat out a 2-mana card. It has nothing to do with that. Bait and switch is the reason why we're running that card, because suddenly you don't want to attack into Hunter minions anymore. Do you understand how frustrating that actually is? We, as tempo decks, do not want to attack into Hunter minions, because Bait and Switch, giving them +3/+3, can not only, you know, generate a minion that suddenly we can't kill, but it may just get to a point where, oh, wait a minute, like, I have to use spells and I have to remove, you know, these secrets in a very specific way, and Bait and Switch is really baiting us into, you know, thinking of how to play around secrets, and this may not be the best version of the deck. He's obviously going for like more like Wild Seeds combos and using Hollow Hounds in order to set up for the Starstrung Bow combos, because when this card is played for, like, you know, essentially 3 to 0 mana, that is an absolute insane amount of mana to spend on a 12 attack weapon, essentially. Or I'm sorry, a 6/2 weapon. It's 12 damage. That's the point I'm trying to make here. But this deck feels like it has a lot of potential, to the point where Secret Hunter might actually have a lot of like really, really quick lethals. Funky Monkey did something really insane with this deck. Unfortunately, he hasn't posted anything about it, so I would check out his channel for when he eventually uploads that, because that deck seems like it's going to be extremely massive. And yet another Thaddius Warlock that is running cards like Wing Welding, which we have not seen in any other deck so far, but Wing Welding feels like an extremely good tool in order to get rid of a card that maybe you're not going to use because you're going up against an aggro deck and you just need that AoE as soon as possible. So there might be some potential for running cards like that. But No Hands is also running the Kraken, which I had in my original version of the deck, but my deck just didn't perform, so that's why I showed you the other version that I had more success with. But I think that Ravenous Kraken into Shallow Grave is a hilariously powerful combo that I'm really hoping that we can make work somehow. Because imagine doing that with, like, Drekthir, for example. You attack with a Drekthir, you Kraken it, you play Shallow Grave, that's just 18 damage. This deck really feels like it has, like, so many different ways of being able to scam out the game, to the point where I am kind of worried about Thaddius Warlock being considered, like, the new Thaddius Druid, where it just does its thing, it ignores you, and then suddenly you have to be the one to clean up the mess, and it's a really hard mess to clean up. And speaking of cleaning up hard messes, Treant Druid, this looks like a much better version of my list, running a Seedsman instead of a Wild Growth, running more aggression, it looks like. Still running the Flower Child package with all of these big cards, still running that Topior, but this version of the deck just feels so much better without the Igneous. Igneous just doesn't really make a lot of sense in this deck, unfortunately, I have to admit, after messing with it myself. But then, the only Priest archetype that I will recommend, Astral Automaton. This card actually feels like it's not a meme. It's kind of scary how, like, this gives Control Priest a more pressuring way of being able to kill you, I guess is the best way to put it. Obviously, this isn't Control Priest, but this has a lot of Control Priest-like elements, where you have, you know, Cannibalize, you have Love Everlasting with Sister, you have Identity Theft, you still have Clear the Scene, you don't have the Harmonic Pop anymore, but maybe that makes its way into this deck. You still have, you know, Behemoth and Whirlpool and Aman'Thul. These cards are all extremely good, and it gives you a reason to run the signature version of Rawden. So there's just a lot going for this deck, to where I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just, you know, get this deck out of the way in order to show you guys the really awesome decks, because this actually does feel like an awesome deck. And if Priest isn't just, you know, about 20-40 minute, you know, control mirrors back to back to back, then maybe I will actually be able to try out this Priest archetype and enjoy it, because I enjoyed Control Priest for like a day. And then after that day, I'm like, what am I doing to myself? I absolutely hate myself. I have become everything I swore to destroy. But yeah, I just had to put this on the list because it's an extremely, it looks like an extremely fun deck. And for those of you that want to see the Warrior, here's the Warrior deck. I don't really think this has a lot going for it on this build, but NoHands Gamer had a very similar idea to what I had, to where if you play the Odin and you find the Wind Fury weapon out of Ignis, then you have an insane amount of damage that you can deal with it. It's just about being able to make the most consistent version of this deck possible, to where we have to throw out the meme cards. Maybe Bellowing Flames isn't that good, but honestly, this card just felt really good as like a deal 5, and then if you forge it in the early game, it can essentially become a deal 10 for 3 mana. That is definitely something not to sleep on. I personally didn't use the Stone Skin Armorer, but that's because I was running a deck to where if I drew all of my cards, I wasn't able to get my big combo. The big combo that I set up for, I'll just go ahead and ruin it, for those who may not see the future video, but I would recommend, you know, liking this video and subscribing to the YouTube channel in order to be notified about any future updates. But I would say that the coolest thing that you can do in Warrior is setting up the Ignis weapon with Wind Fury at 5 mana, so you can just, you know, play it as like a 3 attack 3 attack with Wind Fury, and then you can play Odin, and then you can play Igneous Elemental with a Naga Giant on the bottom of your deck in order to give your hero plus 20 attack, and then you can go to the face twice with it. And there's also other armor cards you can stack on top of that, with cards like Heavy Plate, for example, to where you can deal an ungodly amount of damage with this sort of combo. And I think it might be a bit of a meme, but what if it becomes the actual way to play the archetype? It has a lot of potential, in my opinion, and I'm really hoping that Armor Warrior can be somewhat playable. There's also a possibility of doing something with like Enrage Warrior, where you play your Odin and then you do the Enrage combo with a Minotaurin in your hand. And the way that Minotaurin works is that he gains you as much armor as he deals. So if he's got 11 attack, he's got rush, he attacks, he gives you 11 armor, and in some cases it could also be 11 attack. So maybe Enraged Warrior gets to mess around a little bit to where it's not just focusing all in on like this mid-range combo. Maybe it has like a late-game combo that it can go for that isn't just a big Remornia, or you just have another big payoff card. I don't know. Warrior deck builders are really going to have, you know, the challenge set up for them, but there's just so much flavor in this expansion that I had to share these ideas with you guys. But I hope you enjoyed this, you know, top 5 video on what decks to play on day 1. But all of these decks that I recommended have, if they're not going to be meta breaking, they at least have potential to be extremely fun decks, and that's something that I just massively love about everything in this expansion. Everything feels fun. Like, I messed with almost every single class during the Theorycraft stream, and even a deck like Relic Demon Hunter that I've been hating for quite some time did feel a bit fun, even though I was doing some disgusting things with the deck. I'll just tell you right now, Relic Demon Hunter does feel like a really powerful deck, but I didn't know what deck to post here, so just keep an eye on that archetype as it emerges. But that is going to do it for all of these decks in this video for the day. If you like this kind of concept, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, yada yada yada. I'm going to go ahead and get out of your hair because this is already a pretty long video, but hopefully one of these decks gave you some sort of inspiration on what you should be playing on the day 1 of the Titans expansion. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video, and we'll see you for the next one.